This is the Second Studio, hosted by the Architecture and Design Office fame. My name is David Lee, and with me is Marina Duran. The two of us are architects, partners at the office, and of course, hosts of the show. And today our guest is Ana Maria Duran Calisto.
Ana Maria is a designer and urban planner. She is also a visiting assistant professor at Yale, and she co-founded Estudio A0 with her husband in Quito, Ecuador.
Yes, and with Ana, we talk about architecture, anthropology, archaeology, urban research, history, a deep dive of the Amazon, and that's been a lot of her research in the last 30 years, as she said. Understanding the natural landscapes of that place, but also how human civilization over thousands of years has interacted with it, and what we can learn from it today when we are developing buildings and cities. We talk about, of course, her own personal background in Ecuador, how she studied architecture and anthropology and then went off to do different things. And it was a very robust and interesting conversation, definitely the type of guest and conversation where our job is mostly to just listen, absorb, and try to sound somewhat coherent in our questions. And we could listen to her talk for many more hours. So I think you guys are really going to enjoy it. Anything else?
Nope.
Sponsors. If you're an interior designer, you have to check out Programma. Programma is an all-in-one project management tool built with the entire design process in mind. Its specification schedules are streamlined and cloud-based, so they're always up to date and double handling is minimized. With Programma, you can also build your own custom product library. These are just a few of the amazing tools Programma has to offer. Learn more by clicking the Programma link in our episode notes and use the code SECONDSTUDIO at checkout to save 25% off your annual subscription.
Would you like to get as-built faster? IPX has you covered. IPX lets you seamlessly transform laser scans into LOD 300 BIM and CAD files. Whether you've got your 3D scans already or need the full laser scanning service, IPX offers instant pricing and order tracking for scan to BIM services on any project, no matter the size or complexity. Plus, your BIM files can be seamlessly transferred to Autodesk Construction Cloud, allowing your construction team to start work right away. Start your next project on the 50-yard line with accurate data. Click the IPX link in our show notes to learn more.
This is the Second Studio with myself, Marina, and our guest, Ana. Here we go.
My husband's a British Punjabi architect, and we met in graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania many years ago already.
Okay.
We graduated in 2000. So we went through school when what was happening, we had lots of professors who were doing deconstructivism still, like Daniel Libeskind, but we also had a huge contingent of the more like the digital community that was literally leaving Columbia University. And many of those professors went to Penn, like under the Shumi paperless studios. You guys are much younger than me, so you probably didn't experience this transition. But no. Penn still had, it was an interesting moment because you still had the remnants of Louis Kahn's influence. It was this weird, Louis Kahnian tradition of like tectonic poetics. It was wonderful. I personally loved his tradition. And then you had this like digital community coming in. They were very young, all dressed in black, all into computing. And we had to generate form with algorithms, not really draw much with hand or build models, which was quite shocking to me. And then you had these deconstructivist professors and a huge influence still from like Tom Main, Zaha Hadid, Daniel Libeskind, and some others. So that was like sort of my education. And Jazz is a very talented architect, actually. He comes from the British, more Beaux-Arts tradition, I would say. And also from the high tech. So he had an interesting combination of a very like classical education, and you can see it still in his plans that he's a classical architect, but at the same time he's fascinated by technology like most British people are. Whereas I'm more of a Latina, I must say. Culture matters. Culture matters for me was all about nature and society, really. And it was very shocking to me that nature was so absent in these more mechanistic approaches to architecture, which I like. I'm not an anti-technological person, but I just missed seeing nature more present, in our education. But it was quite absent. That was shocking. And the social aspects were quite absent, which for a Latin American was also shocking because we, in terms of cities, most of our Most of our cities have a high degree of self-built, self-managed, de facto neighborhoods, ginormous swaths of urbanisms that are built by the people. So that social aspect, I also missed as a student in the U.S. There was like a cultural gap for me that I had to deal with.
Yeah, that's actually really fascinating. So I know at the outset I said we would start by asking where you're from, but let's continue this part of the conversation because I do think it's interesting. I'm an architect and I also have a degree in urban design. And so I understand the things you're saying. And when I was an undergrad studying architecture, it was always very odd that at least at the studios I happened to take, like culture of the people was never really at the forefront of the conversation. It was always about, in a lot of my cases, like form-driven things, which to your point, like is necessary and whatever, but it always struck me as odd that was never part of it. And the part that was completely missing, like not even in on my mind at all, because it wasn't talked about, is the natural landscape whatsoever. So there was never any crossover between the landscape architecture program and the architecture program, everything else. And I always found that very, 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 very strange.
I completely empathize with you. I think things are changing drastically, or at least here at Yale. And the reason maybe why I love the school, there are many reasons why I love the school, but two of those are that I feel nature's coming back into architecture. Maybe it's a generational shift, but I also feel that the culture is at the center of the explorations we're doing right now. I mean, students are allowed to completely explore almost in, I would say, like in a deep, introverted fashion, if you wish, in terms of just understanding their roots, where they come from. There's a huge diaspora in America. And maybe it is that generation that is at the universities right now and is really asking for a space where they can explore those roots. And they're being given that space, and I find that amazing. That's a big shift. I don't think that my generation, and maybe neither yours, David, was able to explore that. But now they can do it.
Yeah. I agree with that kind of assessment. I don't teach anymore, but I'm invited to critiques every now and then. And I've seen it over the years of students just naturally like coming to the table with the questions of everything that we just talked about, and without needing the teachers to be the ones to kind of begin it. And they're driven to understand it more. And it has to do with the shift in the times. And it's a wonderful thing, really, to see the motivation amongst the students.
Absolutely.
So I also want to quickly say that I think your anecdote about the transition from the Louis Kahn era to the deconstructivist is what I can appreciate, and I can only imagine. That is it never really occurred to me actually that because that was the transition, and that's a very, very strange. That must have created some rifts within the school. I can imagine, like the old guard versus the new guard.
At the time as a student, I feel I didn't have the conceptual tools to understand what was going on at the school. But now looking back on it, I completely understand it. And there was a big rift. It's almost like the Kahnian professors were literally pushed out. Mm-hmm. And their pedagogies were profoundly different. And looking back on it now that I teach, it's interesting to me that depending on how you approach architecture, your pedagogy can be so profoundly different. And I would say that as a student, in retrospect, the Kahnian pedagogy was fascinating because it was about tectonics, but it was also about poetics, the poetics of the material, the poetics of light and shadow. It was about the poetics of the construction system, if you wish. And it was all about the joints. So we would spend lots of time building joints, understanding how materials come together in this, encounter. And what happens when you place a piece of wood with another piece of wood. And then we would look into Japanese, for example, joints and joinery. And I actually enjoy that a lot because there was this poetic dimension to really engaging the materials and the way they come together. It was like a philosophical stand in a way. But what happened then with the digital generation, I had a harder time, not that I don't, that's why I feel the rift even within myself. I love the sciences and I love mathematics. I was a math teacher for 2 years before joining the architecture school because I come from a different background, and that sort of saved me in a way that I could relate to also the beauty and the poetic of mathematics, but I could program as well, so that was not a problem. But there was something missing for me in that approach, because it was all in the computer. We were not building models anymore. We were not drawing by hand, which I feel created a handicap in a way in our generation, because it was all meant to be rendered in the computer. And for example, now when you're meeting with clients, I feel that sometimes you just have to pull out a piece of paper and your pencil and draw an idea and draw a concept and have a conversation. You need to have a conversation with your hands. So I feel that lack of hand drawing has been problematic for that generation, and I think that has been in schools everywhere. I don't think that drawing by hand is underestimated anymore. But yes, it was a big rift for the students, for the faculty, for the university. But I think that it was a huge loss for Penn. The Canyon tradition was pedagogically amazing, and I wish it could be revived now that the students are really interested in environmental tectonics, biomaterials. They're very concerned with climate change, and they're looking at the vernacular architectures of all cultures and indigenous architectures of all cultures, because they feel that the technological approach is sort of like self-deceit. It's a wishful thinking. Oh, we're going to solve this through more technology. The new generation is very skeptic that technology is going to save us, because this generation is very aware of the extractivism that technology demands. So for example, they know that in ChatGPT, if I use it, every question I ask ChatGPT is going to be a huge amount of water consumed by the system. Water is a big concern, but also energy. And yes, some people say, no, but we're going to solve that with mini nuclear plants. Don't worry, Ana Maria.
Right.
But what about the water? And are those mini nuclear plants proliferating all over the world really going to, reduce the footprint? How much? How does it really compensate? So I feel that the students, this new generation is a very interesting generation, because they're hyper aware of extractivism and what it takes to produce our technological realm. And maybe that's why they've gone back to tradition, culture, the indigenous biomaterials, traditional materials. And they're trying to build this new modernity, if you wish, not denying technology and its benefits, but being very aware of its environmental and social and cultural consequences. So I enjoy working with this generation a lot.
Those are big questions for students. So wait, what do you teach? What level of students are you working with these days?
I'm working, for the most part, with post-professional degree students at Yale. So they come from all over the world. We have amazing, incredible cohorts. They're very advanced students. They already have an architecture degree. They have interesting questions because they're doing a design research program. So we have a strong focus on research, but we also have a strong focus on design. So they come with important questions to school, and they get to explore them in depth in a pretty independent fashion. So I learn a lot from them, and I see some patterns. Of course, there's maybe also a bias in the way we're selecting them that I need to think about a little bit more. But definitely cultural, even representation questions are important. Environmental questions are important. Socio-environmental questions are important. Even, I would say, political, ecological questions. So that's what I see, at least among our students. But I see it also among the MArch-1 students that I meet in my seminars, which are, maybe it's the type of student I attract.
It could be, sure. That makes sense.
So maybe there's a total bias in my perception of a new generation, but the type of student that comes to my classes is definitely a student interested, profoundly concerned for the environment, but also for people. They're interested in questions of labor, for example. That is something I was not necessarily thinking about as much before, but now at Yale I'm thinking about it. And also because you come across students from all over the world, you get to experience all these traditions in depth. I had a South Korean student in the last 2 years, amazing, incredible student who I feel really, even though I've never been to South Korea, but through him, I feel I really connected with this like incredibly deep culture through cooking, the culinary arts in South Korea, the agroecological systems in South Korea, and of course the materials, of the vernacular architectures, and even the thermal aspects of the architecture. It was super interesting. Like I love learning from all these cultures and finding common threads, but also incredible differences that you can learn from.
Yeah, see, this is the problem when we interview interesting people. Now I want to go back to school. I'm also curious, the subject matter and the topics you've discussed, but the work that the students are doing, is it mostly research, or does it also culminate in a design of a physical structure of sorts, or like what is the conclusion of their efforts?
Oh, well, and this is a big discussion, within the school, because it's a tough balance.
Yeah.
But I would say that what we aim for is precisely that balance, that the designs that they produce, and it's open in the sense that some students, for example, maybe will design an exhibition, or design a documentary. Like, we've had so many possibilities, but I feel that openness actually has created incredible outcomes. But they are expected to have, to translate their research into a project. And that project could be, curating an exhibition. That project could be, for example, in the case of this specific student, Jong Song Kim, he literally designed an extension for a beautiful traditional architecture in South Korea, sort of like in the hinterlands of South Korea. So it really depends on the student. I had another student who was from my country, from Ecuador, Antonio Velasco, who was working, for example, with the Shuar here in New Haven. There's a very large community of this Amazonian group in New Haven. So imagine this Amazonian diaspora. Wow. So he was studying the Shuar in Ecuador, and then, there's a mega Shuar community here in New Haven, the largest outside of Ecuador. So then he started investigating how that Shuar cultural tradition is adapted in a diasporic condition, if you wish. How it manages to somehow breathe through the cracks of a very different culture, and a culture that may be, not because the culture is so, but because of the situation that we are undergoing right now in the US, where there's so much fear. Many of these Shuar are undocumented immigrants, and the amount of fear that comes with that, and how that translates into the creation of spatial masks, if you wish. So it's like, I need to look Victorian. I keep these like mask that doesn't let anyone know that inside there's a Shuar life going on, and how that Shuar life may be expressed, for example, in the landscaping of the garden, or the way in which they plant and mix different species based on their agroecological systems. And that was like, that was his research, but also the way he investigated it through questioning hegemonic modes of representation within the field of architecture, actually, where we're expected to do perspectives or axonometrics, or draw in a very specific way. But would that reflect Shuar culture in New Haven, or anywhere else for that matter? So he was doing lots of investigation specifically on how architecture represents a spatial cultural reality. And that's something students can do. So it's like research, but at the same time really tackling into different aspects of our field, and how we work through these processes, these questions.
Those are wonderful questions, and that sounds like a tremendous project. Again, you're making me miss school more and more.
Come to Yale.
I know, I might get on the next flight, get after and see what's going on. Because, we obviously went to school for architecture, but now we practice and we have our own office. And so what we do is very different from a lot of things you get to study and research and think about in school. In our case right now. So
well, it kind of feels like, some of the work that maybe we do is not as meaningful as, a lot of the questions that, students have in school and aspirations.
These are also really, really big topics. And I understand that a lot of times, well, at least I should say for myself, I always felt like transitioning from research into a project of sorts was the challenge. I mean, it's all difficult for sure. The research is difficult, but making that transition, that's kind of a make or break. And in my experience, not everyone can do it because it's just really hard, especially once you go really, really deep into the research. It's sometimes hard to kind of almost come back out and understand, the place in the world that you're going to occupy with the research you've done.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And you see that struggle.
Yeah.
It is the toughest part. I feel that we know how to do research. We can learn how to research, and we have learned to design. But putting these two things together, and particularly among students who are tackling some issues that are like super, super complex at multiple scales, I feel that in those cases the struggle is greater. But I have no doubt that when they find the way to bring these back to the ground at multiple scales as well, they will have achieved, the goal of what they were aiming. They will have achieved what they were aiming for. Mm-hmm. And for example, you see this in students. I had another student, brilliant as well and amazing, from Mexicali, from Mexico, Camila, who was looking at the U.S.-Mexico border. That's ginormous. Mm-hmm. And I know there's a considerable literature on the topic. And she went through it and she read the whole, at least what architects and urban designers and urban planners have been writing about the U.S.-Mexico border. But then it's, you go from like this continental scale of this quote unquote line, the borderland really, and the history of it, which is, it is a very complex history, and it's being censored right now, actually. But you see this like shifting line in time, and this like intertwining of cultures that goes deep into the palimpsest of North America. I mean, we're talking about thousands of years of relationships that are being severed by that line, and to go from like tackling all the issues that entails to proposing something very specific within a city. Wow, it's a lot to ask for in 2 years. And to be honest with you, we don't expect 2 years to be able to provide enough of a time span to do so much. But I feel in those cases, what students get out of this is a seed that was planted, and I know that there will be a tree at some point, and it will be magnificent. But at least planting that tree when the issue is so complex, I feel is already a huge first step. And I empathize with those students because my topic has been the Amazon, and again, the Amazon is 70% of the South American continent in terms of area, almost 70%, not quite. It's ginormous. And it's extremely heterogeneous and diverse. So how do you start tackling, how a city should be in the Amazon? Where do you begin, What do you read? It's been a painful, I would say, 30-year pursuit of my life, but I finally feel comfortable. Oh my God.
So at 30 years, we can all, be assured that we'll have some relief after 3 days.
Aren't you ever tired of the Amazon?
No. It's like I want more, it's crazy.
So I do want to go back in time and start from the beginning, just to hear from you where you're from. What was it like growing up there a little bit? And then what was your first step into formal education? Because I believe it was not architecture. So anyway, but what was it like? Yes. Where were you from? What was it like?
I'm from Quito, which is the capital city of a tiny country in South America called Ecuador. Most people know the Galapagos Islands more than the country in a funny way. But the Galapagos Islands are part of the jurisdiction of my country. So it's this very interesting little triangle right on the equator. That's why it's called Ecuador in South America, wedged between Colombia and Peru. So we're sort of a buffer country between these two larger forces, that have been colliding in a way there. Unfortunately, the Hispanic territories fragmented during the Independence War. We have a history which is the total opposite of the U.S., and I think it's very sad because that weakens all of us. We should be a union. But the United States fought to unite territories. We have been fighting wars to splinter ourselves even further. So not that I'm nostalgic of the Spanish Empire, trust me, it was huge. The Spaniards conquered a territory that spans from Mexico to the Patagonia, so you can imagine North, Central, South America. It was ginormous. And during the Independence Wars, we fragmented, even though some of our founding fathers, so to speak, were trying to establish larger unions that never really prospered in our continent, unfortunately. And Ecuador is the byproduct of those splinterings and those fragmentations and those fights. And because we're a small country, we're very aware of how important I feel both Ecuador and Uruguay, which is another triangle between Mama Brazil. I call it Mama Brazil because it's a very large and very feminine and very beautiful country. I love Brazil. Most of the Amazon belongs to the Brazilians. I believe almost 60% of Amazonia is under their jurisdiction. And then you have big Argentina and Uruguay, another little triangle between these two macro forces. And when you're this little triangle, you're very aware that you belong to both. Like in the case of Ecuador, we're part of the cultural realm of Colombia, but we're also part of the cultural realm of Peru. And I'm not talking about, since the Hispanic world emerged with the Spanish conquest, but rather about the deep thousands and thousands of years of common history. So these were networks, cultural networks of, very many ethnicities exchanging, and I'm not talking only about in material terms, exchanging goods. No, I'm talking in terms of culture, knowledge, seeds, all sorts of things. And suddenly, these networks were torn by the colonial powers, by the Portuguese, by the Spanish, by the French, the English, and the Dutch, specifically in the realm of South America. And I feel that these tears are very painful and still bleeding in a way. So as an Ecuadorian, I'm very aware of these tears because we are like a tiny fragment torn away from Peru, which is insanity. We had a mega war against Peru for years over the Amazon and torn away from, Colombia. But we belong to both. We need to stitch these countries back together somehow. So that these deep cultural networks in the palimpsest can breathe again. More than 100, just so that you get a sense of the map. Like, if we don't think about this colonial geopolitical map of the republics and nations of today, the nation states, but if we think about the indigenous territories, the nations that existed when South America was conquered and invaded, brutally so, you have a very different map. And almost 100 original nations in South America are divided by a border. So sort of what happened in Korea, you see everywhere in South America. North Korea, South Korea were separated. There's a clear line. And there's this painful wound in Korea. The same there. So for example, you have the Siecopai. Half of the family, half of this network is downriver in Peru. The other half is upriver in Ecuador. And this case is very common. You have the Shuar, the Ains, which is a group of, several sister nations, let's say. And some of them are on the Peruvian side and some are on the Ecuadorian side. And during the war, the nation state of Ecuador would even force some Shuar to fight against other Shuar who were on the Peruvian side. Wow. So you have these indigenous nations that are torn between 2, 3, sometimes even 4 countries. And when you travel in the Amazon, you just realize how insane the consequences of the colonial system still are today. So you wonder, how can we put this back together, stitch it back together? Literally, like imagine 100 Koreas in South America, nobody talks about them.
You said when you're traveling through the Amazonia, you can feel it. So what is there? Is there physical evidence, or is it, describe for us how one would feel these splits in the Amazonia?
You feel it in the rivers. The rivers are truncated. And you know that rivers are regional economies. And again, I don't want to be too utilitarian, or economicist, because that's so unlike Amazonia. But I think of it in terms of the rivers. Like, for example, all the rivers that flow down from the Ecuadorian Andes are truncated by the border with Peru. So if you're going down the Napo, the natural fluvial regional system is that you trade downriver. You exchange downriver. People flow downriver, yes, then they come back up. But there's this like natural market at the bottom. And the natural market of our rivers, but of course, when I say our rivers, I'm thinking about Peru as well. Because again, those lines are problematic from the perspective of rivers. And when you flow down the Napo, you reach Iquitos. When you flow down the Marañón, which is a massive Andean corridor that links you all the way down, even almost to Cusco. So it's like this very interesting water connection of lots of Andean cultures that then flows into the Amazon. And the Amazon and the Andes are obviously not separate things. But you go down the river and suddenly there's this like barrier to the flow. So you're torn away from your natural market downriver. You're torn away from your ceremonial site of encounter downriver, and from all these relationships that happen downriver. And you feel that very strongly in the Amazon. And sadly, maybe that doesn't happen, for example, if you're going down the Ucayali or down the Huazaga or down the Marañón, because they belong to Peru. Peru is a much larger country. Or if you're going down the Putumayo or the Cauca or another one of the Colombian rivers. But for Ecuador, it's very clear, the truncation. You go down the Pastaza, truncated. Down the Napo, truncated. And the sad part of this story is that all of this happened because of an oil company. So it's the geopolitics of oil. It's crazy.
Wow.
Yeah, it's very sad. That line was created so that there could be a concession for an oil company.
That's crazy.
The border literally follows the line of the oil block.
It's very odd. This like as a species, sometimes we have like no regard at all for the natural environment, and we're motivated by other things, oftentimes just money or power, and then we do these things like cut off rivers. And I think I feel like sometimes one of the biggest mistakes we as a collective species make is that we think we can easily control the natural environment at a certain scale. And I don't know how you feel about it, but sometimes I feel like I don't think that's the right mentality to have.
I think it's that, but I think it's also like we're thinking too locally and not big picture, and it comes back to like basically each country just thinking about themselves rather than thinking as a more of a group, or what does it do to the other side, right? Being a bit more mindful.
Oh, absolutely. And I feel we're paying for it. Climate change is demonstrating that the consequences are here for all of us, because upon Mother Earth, we're not separate things.
Yeah.
Everything's interconnected. Everything is interdependent. And we want to think it isn't, that we can get away with it in some places, even if we sacrifice others, but no, that's not the way nature works.
And there is also, actually thinking about it, going back to our earlier conversation about architecture schools, there's also this belief that technology will just save all of us in everything, right? And it's not that we should embrace aspects of technology, but I also think it's kind of like a false prophecy to just blindly believe that will be the way everything will be made good, in a decade or whatever timeline.
Yes, I feel that sometimes we have too much of a technocratic approach to everything.
Right.
But that is changing as well. I do see a shift. in the sense that we're starting to realize that innovation is not needed only from the perspective, say, in the case of our field, the materials and the construction systems, which of course demand immense quantities of innovation. And ironically, that innovation is stemming from revisiting vernacular architectures, which worked so well from a thermal, from a perspective that has to do with the environmental footprint of architecture. So that is important, and that pursuit should definitely be stimulated, promoted, supported in every single way. But I feel that we're realizing that it's also about policy, that it's also about legal aspects, that we need to look also at those like soft materials, so to speak, the protocols. In that sense, I think Keller Easterling is a wonderful person here at Yale, because Keller has been looking at protocols for decades. Those soft aspects of architecture that have such a strong impact on the built environment, laws, norms, even cultural mores, all sorts of things, information flows, and I think that the architecture community is tackling those as well. Finally,
there's so many different paths to take if you study architecture. It's kind of mind-boggling.
Yes.
I want to go back. So you grew up in Ecuador. One question I did have, when you were describing it as a country that's kind of I think you said sort of a buffer zone, and you described, what it means to be in a country like that very eloquently. I'm wondering, like, for the average person who lives there or grew up in Ecuador, is that conscious, or is it just kind of innately felt when you grow up there, this kind of relation that you have between two countries, and the idea that your identity as a country and as a citizen is not so easily defined as I'm just within my one bubble and I don't care about anything beyond my bubble? Because you described it very well, but like, was that something that was conscious to you when you were, growing up there, or would this kind of have clarity after, you got older?
I think I've gained clarity as becoming older and studying the Amazon, and I didn't understand at a conscious level why I was so obsessed with the Amazon, but it's definitely an Ecuadorian obsession. Like, you grow up in this little country, you grow up in classrooms that by law had to have our shield. Would it be national shield? Our escudo, what would be the word in English? My God, you know how all nations have like a symbol, a coat of arms, so to speak.
Yeah.
And ours had, like the volcano with its water melting into a river that went straight into the Amazon. And it would be written or this one actually, the river goes into the coast or the Amazon. But anyway, this relationship between the mountains, the rivers, and the coast of Ecuador and the Amazon on the other side, on the eastern side. And we would have this wording underneath it saying Ecuador, a Amazonian country. And our Amazonian patch, it's really only 2% or less of the whole Amazonian biome. So it's a tiny little patch. But Ecuador is like completely obsessed with the Amazon. And, when I study the history of it, I understand. And when I understood the most was when I actually went down by river to Belém do Pará and Macapá, which are on the Amazonian Delta. And that was back in 2008, that a trip that completely transformed my life, because crossing the South American continent on the equator by water, not as much through roads, but just like, being in this incredibly dynamic, shifting ground, very amphibian that Amazonia is. And that's when I understood my city, Quito, has always been linked to the Amazon for thousands of years. And actually now looking at the archaeology of the place and studying the deep history of the Amazon, what I'm discovering, ironically, it's taking me back to my country in a funny way. Because I've been all over the place. I've been reading for 10 years more about Brazil than Ecuador. Because I was like, Ecuador's a tiny little triangle there, I need to focus on the large Amazon. But all this reading has taken me back to that little triangle, because actually the oldest transect, literally from the formative, we're talking about 5 to 6,000 years ago. The oldest network, if you wish, that links the coast, the Andes, and the Amazon in a very clear cultural way is in what is Ecuador today. And it's because when you look at the Andean Cordillera, which is this like massive spine structure in South America, it emerged, I can't remember the geological era, but the Amazon used to flow into the Pacific before. So the waters of the Amazon used to go into the Pacific until the plates started colliding and the Andes emerged. And when the Andes emerged, it shifts around and the Amazon starts draining into the Atlantic. But when you look at the Andean Cordillera, it's newer in the north and it becomes younger as you go south towards Chile. And you will see that it thickens in Peru immensely. It becomes this like massive, in Bolivia and Peru, it becomes this ginormous section if you cut a section with your mind through the Andes. And then in Colombia, it thickens again. But in Ecuador, it's this like thin sliver. It's this very thin, you could almost say that it's the neck of the Andean Cordillera. And if you see the section longitudinally, and you cut the section in the other direction, not transversally, but longitudinally, you will notice that the lowest altitude is in what's Ecuador today, in the area where the city of Loja is right now. So you can very easily go from the Ecuadorian coast up into the mountain towards Loja and down into shore territory. Like literally easy, no problem. And ancestrally, you know, there were cultures that occupied all of these realms, the coast, the Andes, and the Amazon. And they would move back and forth with ease. So you realize that this notion of Amazonia as separate from the Andes, as separate from the coast, is really a colonial gaze of the Europeans that came to South America and understood the geography differently. And what you had in these like sections since very early on is this formative period where, how should I explain it? It's very interesting because from an environmental planning perspective, I feel that we need to go back to that origin and rethink it now, because it was very based on the ecology. So what they did is that these networks of original Americans, so to speak, of First Nations, would understood the benefit. They understood the benefits of each ecotope at different levels. You have different ecologies with different plant species, different animal species, different temperatures, different humidity levels, different soils, and they took full advantage. It's like they created synergies with nature. So rather, not that they didn't transform nature, don't get me wrong. Native Americans have transformed nature profoundly, but from a perspective of synergy and not from a perspective of antagonism. So they understood these ecological relationships well and made them even more abundant and took advantage of every level and then exchanged between them. So you would have someone from the coast bringing the salt and the fish, but also cotton or, you know, other elements that were being produced there, and you had the Andeans sharing the potatoes or Andean species like quinoa, and then you had the Amazonians bringing the coca leaves. Talk about coca. Coca is an ancestral sacred plant. It's been very important since the very beginning as an Amazonian endemic species. And they would exchange between each other, so they had this incredible diversity of products because they would occupy the whole transect. And that has been broken. So now you have thousands of hectares just of soybeans and thousands of hectares of just coffee. This monocultural mindset is very problematic. And I know it's funny for an architect to be talking about agriculture.
No, but it's and that's also a colonial mindset, right?
Yes, this separation from agriculture is another one of our insanities.
And now, a quick break to thank the sponsors who support the Second Studio.
This episode of the Second Studio is brought to you by BQE Core, the all-in-one firm management software built for architects. Designed by architects for architects, Core helps you track time effortlessly, manage projects seamlessly, and get paid faster, so you can focus on design and not spreadsheets. With powerful automation and real-time insights, it's everything you need to run a smarter, more profitable firm. See how BQE Core can transform your practice by clicking the link in our show notes. The second Studio podcast is sponsored by Autodesk. Do you know about Autodesk Forma? Available standalone or as part of their AEC Collection software bundle, it's a specialized AI-assisted 3D design tool that can transform early project planning. With Forma, you can rapidly model multiple massing options at the start of your projects and analyze the embodied carbon costs of different volumes, layouts, and material choices. You can then deepen your understanding of your sites by incorporating real-world contextual data for daylight, wind, noise, and more. Start your projects right with Autodesk Forma. Check out the link in our show notes to learn more. Yeah, it's as you're speaking, I remember now back when I was in grad school for that urban design degree, taking courses, and one of the things we learned about was more to do with North America and the stark contrast between how the Native Americans, to your point, lived and understood how to work with, call it the natural landscape, for lack of a better phrase, I suppose, which was like completely different from this idea of like, okay, well, let's throw down a big formerly, let's say, a grid or whatever. Okay, now this parcel of land belongs to me. It doesn't belong to you anymore. And it's completely antithetical to the much more nuanced and complex way of living and creating a society that was there before. My question is that to play devil's advocate, one might feel like, well, these systems or ways of living sound kind of primitive, right? Because they date back I don't know why someone would have that assumption, but it feels primitive, maybe because it's old. Is it really possible to take some of these ways of living or these systems and applying it to modern day life? You're scaling it up. Is that even viable, or are we just looking back?
Oh, yeah, no, it's fundamental. And actually, you're touching on a very important point, because I feel that's one of the aspects of Western culture that we take for granted. And that is a false construction, in the sense that in the West, we have this idea that's very linear and not cyclical and very evolutionary. So we think in terms of the savage and the primitive, right, in the past, in the Stone Age. Then we go into agriculture and there's a Neolithic revolution. And then we go into the urban revolution, and then, the industrial scientific revolutions. And it's this understanding of, a progressive line, right, of evolutionary development. But I feel that in that sense, it's better to think like an indigenous, or maybe even an historically Asian mind, because they're actually similar in that regard. The time is really more like a spiral, and that there are cycles, and that what is primitive is contemporary, and what is contemporary is primitive, and that there's no linear evolution in history. And in that sense, I've had also, I feel that in the Amazon, you feel this very strongly, because there are no cultures that have been more attached to the notion of the primitive savage, or the noble savage as well, right. The Stone Age a person than Amazonians. It's almost like we treat them. Archaeologists in the 60s spoke about Amazonians literally as relics of the Stone Age. So imagine right. the burden that Amazonian carries in terms of this concept. Even between themselves, I have heard Amazonians who have gone through schooling, formal schooling, say to other Amazonians who want to preserve the traditions, "Oh my God, you live in the Stone Age and that's where you want to stay. Don't worry, you keep your stupid agroecological system. I'm going to do an African palm oil plantation." So you even see this clash within the nations, the First Nations. And what's amazing is that I feel that in the West we need to deconstruct that notion and that linearity, because on the one hand, it's very detrimental for the peoples that are associated with the Stone Age, that are perceived as relics of the Stone Age, because they're as modern and as urban and as digital as we are, but they feel that because there's this preconception about them, they don't get access to jobs, they're not treated as professionals, they're not acknowledged as modern, contemporary, urban schwar or what have you. So that's one of the aspects. And the other aspect is that in this linear notion, we very often feel that we're going back in time. So we're regressing. Oh my God, God forbid. Right. But I actually see these systems as much more complex than our current system. So for example, if you compare, and sorry to go back to agriculture again, but I feel that, and then we'll talk about architecture in the Amazon. Yeah. But if you think about a monoculture, what can be more simplified as an ecology from the perspective of complexity, if you wish, than a monoculture? It is one species, often a GMO, spreading through thousands of hectares. So the macro complexity of a rainforest is being reduced to a mechanical simplicity that has zero complexity. I mean, I'm not as excited, for the machine that's running that monoculture. I'm much more excited by the complexity of the rainforest that has probably potentially 100 medicinal plants. And another thing that I've learned to do studying the Amazon is to break this notion that quote unquote, let's say primitive science or indigenous science is way down, the hierarchy compared to Western scientists. When you study them in tandem, what you realize is that many of the advances in the West happened thanks to knowledge that was drawn from shamans in the Amazon. Or just from, the Amazon. For example, very simple case is rubber. Rubber is an endemic plant of Amazonia, and the Europeans had never seen it, of course, before Columbus. The first European mention of rubber is because one of the, when they took some Aztecs back to Spain, the Aztecs brought their balls with them, and they were bouncing all over the place, and the Europeans were completely shocked. They were like, oh my God, these people have this material that we don't understand it. It actually bounces back. It doesn't just fall like hule, which is the closest thing to, to rubber in Europe. And that was a description. And without rubber, you would have had no industrial revolution.
Sure.
Because it's a fundamental material in machines. Machines don't work without rubber. Cars don't run without rubber. And of course, there's the whole question of vulcanization, and the historians are proving now that the Aztecs already had vulcanizing processes. But Amazonians used rubbers in many different ways, and the Europeans saw this and they were like, wow, this plant has potential. Europeans were always looking for useful plants, useful everything, taking it back and then, inventing things with these different materials that they were finding in Amazonia. So rubber is one example, no industrial revolution without the Amazon. And another one is within medicine. The indigenous cultures of the Amazon use different types of what they call curare, which is a mix of plants that literally paralyzes the fish. So sometimes when they want to fish, they spread this in the waters, the fish go numb and they come to the surface, they're floating, and then they catch many of them. And this was key to developing all the systems that we use right now in medicine to do surgery. We use these of course, synthesized versions of the curare. What's the word in English for when you're going to get surgery? You first need
anesthesia?
For anesthetic purposes, exactly. So these advances in science would not have happened without Amazonian knowledge. And almost something like a quarter of the medicines that we use come from medicinal plants from the Amazon. So the way I see it is like whether Humboldt or La Condamine or some other naturalist transmitted the information doesn't mean that information did not belong in the first hand to an indigenous scientist. And I use the word scientist on purpose to break down these notions that one is a scientist and the other one is, a wise man or something of the sort. They were scientists, they are scientists in their own right. Yeah. And the amount of knowledge they've shared with us, once you realize how much of it's massive. It's seriously, there's no modernity without Native America. But they don't get the credit for that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's really fascinating. It also really highlights the importance of what kind of words we use to describe things and how that completely reshapes The reality, actually, really. So you ended up going to initially to study anthropology. Is that right?
Yes, I initially moved to Italy because my idea was I wanted to be an architect when I was young in high school.
Oh, really?
Yes, and of course, with my limited, it's funny, that when you're 17, what do you think? I was like, I want to be an architect. Therefore, I have to go to Italy. That's where Rome is. So I thought that's the country where I need to become an architect because that country is amazing architecturally. So I went to Italy for a year, learned Italian. I got into the University of Firenze in Florence, and I didn't stay there. I decided to return at a young age, which is also shocking. I was a bit taken aback by the Italian academic system in terms of its structure. It was very, for my taste at that age, it was like old-fashioned. I liked the American system more because it was a flexible system of credits that would allow me to explore a little bit more. Mm-hmm. And I felt that the Italian system was very rigid. Like they gave me a list of classes and the dates of the exams and when I had to pass those exams. And if I passed those exams, I would move on to the next level. Mm-hmm. But what if something happens to me? I get sick, I have to go to Ecuador, something happened there, or I miss, or I just fail the exam. And they were like, no, it's okay. You wait for a semester or for a year to try it again. And I was like, oh my God, but I don't want to take 9 to 10 years graduating from architecture. So I called my dad and I was like, Dad, I think I want to go back to Ecuador and I want to just study within, the credit American system. And I returned. But the school that I wanted to go to that had this American system didn't have architecture as a field. So I ended up becoming the first liberal arts graduate, and my major was in anthropology.
Interesting. So a couple questions. Why and how was architecture on your radar, when you were a teenager, and why did you want to become an architect or study it? And then the second question is, what was the degree in anthropology like? Was it somehow sculpted so that it was sort of parallel to architecture, or was it strictly anthropology?
I guess it was strictly anthropology. And but going first back to your first question, in terms of, I didn't know that anthropology existed at all. Why was I interested in architecture? I've always been naturally just obsessed with the built environment, always observing and looking. And I guess that a big influence in my life was my uncle, Rafael Vélez Calisto. He's a very well-known architect in Ecuador, and we were always in the family talking about his buildings. He built a lot, hundreds of buildings in the country. Wow. So I was always like observing his buildings and paying attention to it and analyzing the structure. Sometimes we would go with him, I don't know, in a weekend. There would be a coincidence and we would end up in one of his construction sites, or just my family would talk about it. Oh, he's building here, he's building there. Right. So I would really pay attention to his buildings. I know them all. I know where they are. It's like I look at Quito and it's almost like I see the names of architects are so anonymous for most citizens, but not for me. I know who built what everywhere. And so I guess that was a big influence growing up. And the other thing that marked me is that when I was when I had graduated from my undergrad studies, I was frustrated because I was like, I love architecture and I didn't study architecture, and I enjoyed doing liberal arts, but anthropology was a disappointment at the time because it was too colonial for my taste. I would read all these books by anthropologists and I was like, oh my God, this is so colonial. This discipline, it's like crazy. So I was a bit, I was having conflicts with anthropology. It has evolved. It has changed. Anthropology is a different realm right now, and it's amazing. I'm sort of going back to it, but for a while I wanted nothing to do with anthropology because it was too colonial for my taste. But then, because I had this love for indigenous cultures in Latin America that has been with me forever, and I decided I wanted to go to Machu Picchu and Cusco in Peru. So I had never traveled in can you believe it? I had been to Europe, I had been to the States several times, and I had never traveled to another country in South America. So it's the colonial mindset,
Right.
I was a colonial mind and a colonial body and did not even question it. But I went to Peru and I walked from Ollantaytambo to Machu Picchu. At the time, I'm very old, the Shining Path was still active. So tourism in Peru was actually at a historical low. Nobody would go to Peru, and let alone walk in the Andes, because people were scared of the Shining Path, and there were problems, there were conflicts, there was a lot of violence at the time in Peru. But I went, and I was very lucky to be able to walk from Ollantaytambo to Machu Picchu at the time, because it was this like silent expedition. We were two of my friends with me and two Peruvians who guided us, and that was a life-changing experience. It was incredible. The Inca way of constructing space was completely mind-boggling to me. I was like, these people think differently about architecture and landscape architecture and the city, and I need to understand how they think about it, because I personally talk about this linear evolution. I perceived it as superior to the Spanish mode that we had been taught. Superior in which way? Because again, these are values, this is relative, it's just an opinion. In the sense that superior from the perspective of the relationship it established with nature. There was this synergy between the built environment and the quote-unquote natural environment. I couldn't perceive a separation. I couldn't perceive an antagonism. I couldn't perceive what I saw in my own mestizo culture, which was brutally aggressive towards the landscape in its expansion. So I was like, I want to learn from the Incas. Why is it that they do things differently? And how so? There was a different paradigm, and I couldn't fully figure it out. But I knew I wanted to go back to architecture and bring that with me, because there was something there that really mattered to me. That's when I decided to apply I didn't know that I could study architecture in the States, because the States has this very open, flexible academic system that is mind-boggling in other countries. We don't have that level of flexibility. So when I was looking for universities back then, in the paper world, going to the Fulbright, looking at all these fat books, looking at the ranking in these fat books, and I thought I'll just study archaeology and I'll devote my life to the conservation of archaeological sites, the First Nation archaeological sites like Machu Picchu, like Chan Chan, there are so many in the Amazon as well. And so I applied to Penn because they had a very strong Andean archaeology program, and Clark Erickson is there, who's one of my favorite archaeologists. And they also had a strong landscape architecture program and a strong historic preservation program. And I applied to Columbia because they had an interesting art history and archaeology program. And I also applied to Cornell just because I knew Cornell. Don't forget, sure. I'm an Ecuadorian student, so these are the bits of information that I get from the world. And I ended up getting into Penn and Columbia. Columbia was more of a PhD program, and Penn was. And what was amazing at Penn is that I had wishful thinking checked also architecture, but as one of those things that you do because you're frustrated that you didn't do it. And they were pushing for dual degrees at the time. So I just, I had my historic preservation application, and I thought, I'm just going to check architecture as well. And then I get accepted, and they said, before I got accepted, they said, we are processing your application, but you did not submit a portfolio. We need a portfolio. You didn't need it for historic preservation, but you needed it for architecture.
Right.
And I was like, oh my God, I wish I had not checked the architecture. Now I'm in trouble. I didn't even know what a portfolio was at the time. So I sort of had to figure it out. And, with the limited means I had a paper copy of the Penn program, and I read under portfolio the description, and it said something like sample of drawings and visual material. And there was a maximum size to it, of course. You're going to laugh because that's how ignorant I was about the architecture world. I thought, oh my God, I have drawings and paintings, but nothing so small. What am I going to do? It didn't occur to me to take a photograph and send photographs.
Oh, wow.
I just rolled them up, the number that they requested as a minimum, something like 10 or 12. I rolled them up, stuck them in a tube, and mailed the tube to the university.
That's amazing.
I'm shocked that I got it.
That's amazing.
Yeah, but that's how it all started. That's how my relationship with architecture started.
Gotcha.
But
They get the tube and they were like, wow, this is the only tube we got this year. She's in.
Yeah, that's a tactic.
Probably
That's
in the
amazing.
history of the school, this was the only tube they received.
So it's what's really interesting about you as well is your expertise, your education, and your interests are very, very diverse. And it seems like, throughout your life and what we've heard today is you kind of follow where your interests are and where how do I phrase it? Like where the next logical question comes up is where you go. And
Yes.
I guess the reason why I say that is one of the questions I had before we started the recording, which I think you've already kind of answered, is I think for a lot of architects who go to architecture school, they have an idea of what they are going to do afterwards. That is, they're going to like design buildings and be an architect and do blueprints and whatever. And sometimes it's difficult for those folks to, how do I say it, allow themselves to have the openness to fully explore in great detail and depth other things that they come across during their life and their education, because they feel like they have to become an architect and draw buildings, which obviously you're the co-founder of an architecture studio, but you've also had this openness to how you approach things. So I guess the question is, was there ever a time throughout all of this where you felt like you should have been, I don't know, practicing more as a standard architect or doing something else more as a typical and fitting inside neatly like a particular niche or profession of architecture or anthropology or archaeology or something, and just kind of stay in that lane and not spread yourself across these different ones?
Oh, absolutely. I feel I followed the pathway for sure, the one that you're expected to follow. So the part that I never did is that I know that in school there was this sense that we had to work for a famous architect. That was like the first step. That's something
Right.
I definitely skipped. I didn't do that. So I graduated from Penn and I had this very strong sense that I wanted to be an independent architect, that I wanted to start my own thing. And that I didn't need to go through famous architects to do that. So what I did, I actually worked in New York for a very small firm that was opening, that was starting, with a South Korean architect. His name David Yom. I think he still has an office in Tribeca. And it was only David and me at the beginning, and then one more employee. And it was interesting for me because I wanted to see how you actually set up a firm, how you get started, what it involves, what it takes. And then also, serendipity, the things that just happen to you, because part of the reason why we started the architecture office so early with my husband was because we were in New York on September 11th. I had gone back to Quito to get my H1. Well, maybe you don't. I don't. Are you U.S. citizens, both of you?
Yeah, thankfully, although these days it doesn't seem to mean a whole lot.
So neither one of you had to go through the international students have to get different visas. They get an OPT when they graduate to work for a year in America, and then you have to find a sponsor. You probably have sponsored maybe international architects.
Yeah, so I'm an American-born citizen. Marina is a citizen by what's the phrase? I mean, you're French, and then she became a citizen last year.
By marriage, but yeah, I moved to the States as an intern with an internship visa, and then eventually, got married and got all my paperwork. But yeah, we're familiar with the whole H1B and OPT and all of those,
Fun things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so for my H1, David sponsored me. I went back to Ecuador to get my visa stamped, my 3-year H1B visa. Mm-hmm. And my husband stayed back. He was working at the time at KPF on 57 and
Okay.
7th.
I
They
worked
have
at KPF.
moved. You worked at KPF as well.
Yeah,
Maybe
yeah.
you would have met jazz in another generation.
It's possible.
Well, he was there. I was in Quito. So what happened is that Jazz is he's a Punjabi. He's a Sikh. So there was a lot of animosity against the Sikhs after September 11th.
Oh.
And he just didn't feel comfortable in Manhattan anymore. It was weird, and he decided to go back to England. So he was working in London, and I was working back in Quito. I started teaching when I returned, thinking, okay, well, I'll be here for a semester, and then I go back. Then we meet again in New York and see what's next. But in the end, what ended up happening is that the opportunity to build came up in Quito. So I phoned Jazz. We had no cell phones at the time. I phoned him and I told him, why don't you come for 3 months? We design this, we find a local partner, and then we can move back to New York, and we can have our first build work. And that is fantastic to start an architecture office. We need a portfolio of build work. But what ended up happening is that we started getting another project and another project and another project and another project in Ecuador. So we built a house for a very wealthy family. It's a very funny house looking back on it, because it's this weird, how should I call it? It's this like handmade, deconstructivist, sort of minimalist thing with some like historic inspirations, which are maybe more postmodern, but historic in the Inca sense of the word.
Yeah.
So it's this like very strange syncretic thing that we did. And we started doing some interior projects as well. We did a gym that was fun. And we started doing another house, a tiny house in a historic area. So that was a different experience. And for 2 years, we were just like doing one project after the other. So it didn't make sense to go to England. It didn't make sense to come back to New York. And we were just thinking, okay, we'll do this one and we'll go back. We'll do this one and we'll go back. Jazz has been there for almost a quarter of a century.
Wow.
And I have moved a lot because I'm the partner that became more of an academic. Mm-hmm. Practicing for me was very difficult because with age it has become easier. I have to say it's easier to be an older female architect than a young female architect in Ecuador. Mm-hmm. But when we started, there was a very small presence of Ecuadorian female architects. Those who were around were generally with a male partner like myself. Mm-hmm. And it was just very upsetting to me that the clients would never look at me in the meetings. They would never talk to me. So It was like, don't look, don't hear, and you feel invisible. And they would only refer to me when they had to ask something about the receipt or the contract or, some sort of a secretarial kind of role.
Yeah.
And they would acknowledge me finally when it was about that administrative aspect of the office. And that was very upsetting to me.
Which is the most fun part of the job, is to keep track of receipts.
It's a big part of it, for sure. Absolutely.
I mean, that's silly, yeah.
And Jazz at the time didn't speak Spanish, so I was, translating the building code for him. So I knew the building code by memory so that I could help him with the plans, make sure they were according to code and explaining all the code. And I was translating all the contracts. And, I was doing a lot of that work. And it was just like, my goodness, it's like I was becoming very angry, to be very honest with you. And I decided I didn't want to be that person, that angry woman who's opening a space in this world through aggression. So I was like, is this the woman I want to be? No. So I decided to. I call them the cracks. I decided to find cracks within the world of architecture where I could grow. And those were the Quito Biennale. So I participated in the first one in the academic commission. The second one, I was the executive secretary, we call it, which is sort of like the director. You're in charge of everything. So I started working on biennales. I started writing about architecture. I was like, okay, I can't design and build, but at least I can write about it and influence the way others design and build. I started interviewing architects. I started teaching. I started doing all the things that I continue to do right now. researching. So that doesn't mean that I completely got away from architecture. I have been hired 2 times for being a woman, which is amazing, shocking. So I did get to do, not just with Jazz as a partner, all of the work that we did in the first years was together, but then he's been doing the work on his own. I have sort of drifted away. And but there were occasions in which I was invited to do the project myself. And one of them was a house for a former student, which was interesting because I was like, but you were my architecture student, this is great. You need to design your own house. And he was like, no, I became a businessman. I already designed it. It's horrible. I don't want to live in a house designed by myself. And then I became used to being like the channel that people would use to reach my husband. So the next thing I did subconsciously, at that point I was not angry anymore, I was happy doing my things. So I just wrote back to him and said, oh, then here's Jazz's phone number. You can call him so that you guys can meet. And he was like, Ana Maria, if you don't want to design my house, it's okay, just be honest, let me know, we don't waste more time. I have another woman in my second in my list that I'm going to call because I want to work with a female architect. And that shocked me. It was like, wait a minute. I haven't been hired for being a woman and you want to hire me because I'm a woman? We need to have a coffee. Yeah. So then he explained why he wanted to work with a woman, and it was a super fun project. I loved it, and it's built. I haven't visited it in a while, but it came out really well. And then I also had the opportunity of doing more of an interior design project when a friend of mine invited me to design a room in a love motel. This is a funny story. Wow. Yeah, this is an awesome friend in Ecuador he's gay, and he was hired to do this love motel. And I say it because he wanted a diversity of gender approaches. So it was like 10 rooms, and he was like, how many sexual fantasies can I have? I want sexual fantasies from, different people with different stances in life in terms of gender, to see what comes up so that we can offer these different experiences. So I was like the heterosexual woman, I guess, in the group, and that was a fun project as well. So what I've done alone has been super fun.
That's really cool. You need more than 10 rooms though if you want to explore all the different angles.
Yes, you need thousands. He had more of a menu though.
A menu. That's wonderful. I want to mention real quickly, because I saw it through a really, really cool lecture you gave at, I think it was Harvard, that's online, that there was a project, and I'm zooming into a very specific project, but there was a project that was for the University of the Amazonia, something like this? Yes. Like a decade ago, more than a decade, I think. But I wanted to highlight it because it's online, and maybe we can get some images from you. And I recall seeing that there was a proposal made by a different office, and it was, if we talk about ecological sensitivity, that other proposal was atrocious. I'll say that. And then you guys proposed, I think it was through your studio with your husband, proposed a project as well. And from what I remember, it was beautiful, and it seemed to make a lot of sense and hit all the marks. But then ultimately, I'm just reciting the anecdote. I believe that like the president at the time didn't like it because it wasn't modern enough, or something like that.
Yes, that was the big turning point. That was the crisis. That was when I decided to go for a PhD. Because we won that competition, and as you know, architects, we dream about winning competitions, and particularly of projects like these, which are educational, cultural, that have a social significance. And this was in Amazonia. It was 3 offices. We were 3 small offices. It was a massive competition, so that independently we couldn't fulfill the requirements of the call for qualifications. So we joined forces. We passed the qualification component, and then it was a design competition. And it was Santiago del Hierro, who had been my student at San Francisco, and he's one of my best friends still today. So he was one of the offices. The other office was Gabriela Anker and her husband, who's American, and us. So it was like these 3 tiny offices coming together to do the call for qualifications and then the design. And it was super fun. And we believe that we could do a difference, shrink the footprint of this massive project that had been proposed already by Incheon, which is a company in South Korea. They were thinking more like first world, you know. They were thinking global north, not really global south, and definitely not Amazonia. And we really shrunk the footprint and wanted to make it more inspired in Quechua and Waurani architectures, vernacular architectures, but understood through a modern lens, if you wish, in terms of like all the equipments and all the needs that the university had, because Amazonia is very humid and very hot. And if you're going to have a library there, for example, you need to protect the books or they won't last very long. So that you have to have certain thermal conditions that you meet and so on and so forth. But the sad part, and that's why it drove us all into a crisis, I feel, not just me, was that our proposal was rejected because precisely was not modern enough. So having inspired ourselves on the vernacular architectures of Amazonia, I guess made the president think that, you know, this looks too much like an eco-lodge and not enough like a university. I want a modern university. And that's when we broke down as a group. We collapsed. We were all in a horrible crisis. I pretty much ceased to participate in the project, to be honest with you. I sort of like did what I could up to a certain point, but after that, I felt that the project was not in our hands anymore. The government wanted to build it with steel structure and CMU walls.
What?
Okay.
Yeah. The wood components became almost like an ornamental attachment. In some areas, they're still playing the role of a filter, but in some areas, they're just on the wall. So it just felt that the government was not getting us. And I thought, unless we change the mentality, architecture is not going to be able to change. That's how I felt as an architect. So why should I keep on doing architecture if the mentality is forcing a pathway that I don't believe in? So I thought I'll go for it to do a PhD. I'll find, an advisor, and I'll try to write books about what architecture and city means in Amazonia, so that we don't keep destroying this place, because that's what we've been doing. We've been destroying Amazonia, imposing our paradigms upon these incredible landscapes, incredible ecosystems, and reducing them to nothing. So yes, that's when I diverted.
Interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. I bring that project up because when I first saw the original proposal, my unbiased opinion was it was phenomenal. Like, this is hitting. It was very modern to me, first of all. So the idea that's not modern enough, I found to be ridiculous. But like a modern, interpretation to take whatever. But it hit all of the marks, and I'm like, this is great. But it also highlights the very important topic of like preconceptions that many non-architects who are in positions of power have of desirable architecture to make their city, their country, their place announce itself as if it's like now first world leading the conversations of modernity and technology and all these things. And that preconception oftentimes is steel and glassy boxes with CMU or whatever else.
Exactly.
And it's a completely disgusting. I love steel and glass, but it's like it's not the right place to start from, right?
Exactly. It depends on the context. Like, we build a lot with steel and glass, and I guess that in Quito I don't feel as uncomfortable with it. But for some reason in Amazonia it just felt incredibly uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I guess it has to do a lot as well with this temperate versus tropical space. I feel that the tropics have been mistreated immensely because we bring all these temperate models and we impose them. Like, for example, when you think about Singapore and all the HVAC that goes into creating these spaces that are like, first world, non-tropical. In the tropics, It's almost like you're creating these spaces of ice in the hottest areas of the world. Yeah. So, of course, I don't think that architecture and urban design and landscape architecture and urban planning have given enough space in the hegemonic culture to the tropics, to understanding the tropics, to really understanding the tropics, so that we can respond accordingly. And that's what I've been doing through the PhD in the last 10 years, is tackling with what architecture means in the tropics. It's a different ontology of architecture. What does the urban mean in the tropics? What does landscape architecture, what does agriculture mean in the tropics? And for example, what I've learned from Amazonians is that the main architecture in Amazonia is the forest, because Amazonians think in terms of planting architecture, which is something that we definitely do not do in the West. The first step in an architecture in Amazonia is planting it. So they think in terms of like what is going to be needed. It's part of the equation of agriculture is construction. So it's almost like construction and agriculture in Amazonia are inseparable. So you plant your architecture. There's a notion of generation. There's a notion of time. You're using the materials that were planted by another generation when they were planting the architecture for you, kind of approach. And I love that because it never loses the spirit of the forest. So for them, it's a living architecture that is part of the territory that, in an animistic perspective, is simply the same forest under a new form. So there's no separation between earth and architecture, between earth and city. It's the territory under a new form, it's the living territory, the quote-unquote city or the agroecological constellation of inhabitation. And the same with the architecture. It's a new form of the forest. And I wonder sometimes whether in architecture school, in the first year, we should do both things. Plant a garden and build, one of those design build workshops that are so important to architects. Should we have both happening so that we think about the implications of what we make in terms of, the environment, so that we see the very intricate relationships between these two realms, not as separate, but as different manifestations of the same thing, whether we're using minerals or, biological materials, which in the end are not binaries either. Our bodies have minerals, and minerals can contain organic components. So I feel that this split needs to be addressed urgently, and that's the split that I felt very strongly working in the Amazon.
That's wonderful. That's a great description. Also, a pretty good place to wrap this up, because we're right at the hour just about. The final question we always like to ask our guests, and we'll ask it to you as well, is what is your favorite building?
Well, or we can ask you, what is your favorite thing about the Amazon?
Okay.
If it's easy enough.
Or both questions.
I guess that they're related. I would say that my favorite buildings are definitely from Asia. I love Japanese architecture. I like the work of Kengo Kuma. He's been a huge influence in my life. And what I love about the Amazon, which is what I love about New York as well, the alter egos, but we call them the urban jungle, don't we? Is diversity. Absolutely. That's what defines these spaces. Hyper diversity. I don't feel comfortable in spaces like a monoculture that are about homogeneity and the reproduction of only one thing, by the thousands. I think that's what New York and the Amazon share. It's their diversity.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. I'll lastly say that we just took a trip to New York, and we used to live there for a number of years, and haven't been there in a long time. And one of my observations from the trip was that I miss the diversity and the intensity, but the diversity. And I similarly actually feel very odd when I step into a place, whatever place, and it's homogenous. And I was mainly thinking about the people, in fact. But it's like an unsettling feeling to not see a mixture of people when you get used to living in a place like New York.
Absolutely. We're very similar.
Anna, this was wonderful. Thank you so much for making the time on a Friday. Conversation went by quickly. We could keep talking for the next 12 hours, but we'll save some of it for the next time. I appreciate it a lot.
Next time I come to Los Angeles, I'll let you know. Maybe we meet in person. That would be wonderful.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to this week's episode. If you liked the interview and you want to support our show and help us keep going, then the best way to do that is to leave a review of the podcast, where we are in the Apple Podcast app. We are in the Spotify. We are also on YouTube, and you can find us as well on Instagram and Facebook. But mostly we're on Instagram, so you can follow, like, comment, be part of the community. And other forms of reaching out to us are, we have a website, which is secondstudiopod.com. The email is hello@secondstudiopod.com, and we have a hotline which you can text or leave a voicemail, and that is 213-222-6950. So if you have any topics you want us to cover, questions we should answer, guest suggestions, anything else, reach out to us via any of those ways. And we appreciate you guys listening. A lot more fun and interesting guests to come, and we'll talk to you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.